Hello, and welcome to Eskasoni. Today we're talking about Gordon Smith's article on Lee Cremo. Lee Cremo was one of Cape Breton's most important fiddlers. He, as you read in the article, or as you can read in the article, he was an internationally respected traditional fiddler and here's the question. The whole thing boils down to the question of what we mean when we say someone is fiddling in the Cape Breton style. Cremo was born in, he was actually born in Chapel Island just prior to the Great Movement when through processes of centralization, processes of consolidation, the Mi'kmaq of Unama'ki were moved into a number of different communities to sort of consolidate access to services and so on. There are 5 communities in Cape Breton: Wakagama, Orgamacook, Potlatek, Membertou, and Eskasoni, but Eskasoni is certainly the largest of them. And if Chapel Island is sort of the spiritual center of Mi'kma'ki, Eskasoni is sort of more the capital, as it were. Chapel Island is the Jerusalem, and Eskasoni is the Tel Aviv. So he moved to Eskasoni when he was just a child. His father was a fiddler as well. And his father was a fiddler and what they called sort of a kitchen fiddler. He would go on, for lack of a better word, tours. Go from house to house during the seasons and play for a couple of sort of on a pass the hat situation. So he was on the cusp of being a professional musician, and he had this good reputation, and he was meeting the expectations of what constituted a good fiddler. I think we always need to look at the very specifics when we're talking about tradition bearers, that odd word that we sort of get from Karl von Südhof and is also kind of in the popular consciousness as well, because we tend to think in beautiful abstractions. We being academics and we being people who are looking back in hindsight, and we who sometimes act as gatekeepers and arbiters of the authenticity of a tradition, whether or not we actually have any particular stakes in it. So what I found most fascinating about reading Smith's work on Cremo is that, Smith was part of this movement of, again, looking at people as they actually are and not necessarily as we would like them to be, and not thinking purely in this sort of tradition bearer mode as if this person is representative of the tradition, and then we're trying to sort of, we have this idea of what this music comprises, and then we have this person who is exemplary at it, and we try and mesh them together as best we can, rather looking at the person, looking at the music that they actually play, and beginning with this close reading. So what my point was about his father, Simon, and then subsequently Lee, the question for me that this article raises, this chapter raises, is this notion of the people who play the music itself. What is their understanding of the music that they play? And more importantly, what is the understanding of their audience? Because the problem with the tradition bearer argument is it seems to be, in a way, putting upon them this role of pushing the tradition out there, being the representative, being the person who is responsible for its promulgation. as if that's something that happens independent of living, as if that something that happens independent of real contexts and the real pragmatism and the actual contexts in which tradition gets performed. Because they were, both he and then both his father and then subsequently Lee were both musicians that were operating within a particular context, and they were playing and they were bringing what they knew to be something that has meaning, something that has aesthetic pleasure, something that has a demonstration of skill, and something that also meets the expectations of their audience. And then we get stuck in this epistemological question about what constitutes tradition and what constitutes the individual's relationship to the tradition. So the first half of the article is fairly straightforward biography, and it demonstrates that Cremo had a well-earned and well-attested to reputation for competency isn't the right word because it's not as strong a word as one would desire, but of demonstrably being a heralded practitioner of the instrument and the repertoire that the instrument around here is most closely associated with. But the fascinating part is the second half of the article, because then Smith examines Cremo's reputation for this. How is Cremo understood, basically, again, using this word, as a tradition bearer? And he has two distinct groups. It's almost statistical. He has like 25 people he interviewed and half a representative of one group. And that is basically people who are part of the quote-unquote Cape Breton music scene, and specifically the Cape Breton Gaelic, Scottish, fiddle, and accompanying tradition music scene. Record producers, radio personalities, Doug McPhee, the piano accompanist, and how they consider Cremo. And then the second half of his sort of sample group are Mi'kmaq, First Nations people, who are putting him in this, who are evaluating him as a player and evaluating the sort of understanding that they have. And what gets me, and what I find so delightful from Smith's conclusions, is that, as it were, the Cape Breton musicians, and the language is blunt, but basically the whites, the Scots music, the non-native population, they are assessing Cremo, and they think he is sort of one of the greats. He's exemplary in form and has, you can feel the influences of the Winston Scotty Fitzgeralds. You can feel the influences of how he has absorbed these things. And then when they talk about him, it's almost as if Cremo, as a Mi'kmaq person, that's like an interesting bit of trivia. But it's more like he sort of adapted this style very well. I was like, oh, and I think they think that they are paying him a compliment by saying, like, oh, it doesn't even matter. You know, the fact that he's Mi'kmaq doesn't matter to me. He is an exemplary player. And it is like it's not a negative thing to say. It's just like a dim thing to say. And the converse is how Mi'kmaq community players as well, musicians as well as non-musicians, understand Cremo. Because on the surface, he isn't playing music that one would associate with a Mi'kmaq musical heritage. Both from an outsider perspective, like the Doug McPhee's in that community, and even from an insider perspective, this was not really sort of when people are putting on sort of capital M Mi'kmaq displays, this musical tradition wouldn't necessarily be what is present. And so, but they're not phrasing it as, look at how well he has adapted to that style. The way that they phrase it in Smith's article is more about how adept he is at the Mi'kmaq practice of taking the music, or taking the forms that are around one and bringing them together. That this assemblage, this act of syncretism, this act of not being a gatekeeper and saying this is authentically Mi'kmaq and this is not, but just taking whatever is at one's disposal, whatever one has on hand, and creating meaning from it. That is an inherently Mi'kmaq thing. That is part of the long history of the Mi'kmaq of not being prejudicial about what can constitute their performance styles and what constitutes their repertoire. So it's not that Lee is or was being a tourist in Cape Breton, in that Cape Breton music, that he was remarkably adept at this non-Mi'kmaq music. Rather, this is Mi'kmaq music too, and he is exemplifying this style. And as I was reading this, and here's my secrets. I read these articles over time, and before I do the videos, I reread them. I make a little bit of notes about what I'm going to talk about. Yeah, these are actually planned. I was rereading it today and trying to sort of wrap my head around what I would want to say today. You're going to think me weird, but the parallel that I came up with for Lee Cremo is Bruno Mars. Because Bruno Mars, brilliant musician, and what he is very brilliant at is adapting. That's not the right word. Damn, Ian. He is very good at participating in this musical tradition that has typically been understood as African-American pop music. I mean, you can see the sort of resonances of his performance. And on one hand, you have the positive criticism, the sort of pop critics who discuss Bruno Mars as that, as sort of like an excellent mimic, as it were, of this new, of immigrant ancestry. He's of Filipino ancestry, but from Hawaii, if I recall. See, I should have prepared more about the history of Bruno Mars, but he is playing American music in this way. And then I'm thinking of what Karen Tongson, who is an American, a Filipino American, Filipina American, pop culture academic at one of the University of California campuses near Los Angeles. And she speaks of Bruno Mars as actually being very active in the Filipino music community, the Filipino music tradition of syncretism, of adapting styles for their own participation, that they are not pretending at or being exemplary at that musical style. Rather, what they are exemplary at is adapting the pop culture that surrounds them. And we can use the word folk culture when we go back to Lee Cremo if we really need to distinguish those, because their understanding of performance is about syncretism. It is about embodying and inheriting and living in these musical traditions. So Bruno Mars is playing Filipino popular music when he is doing something that is virtually the same as to the untrained ear or to the cynical ear. He's just doing North American music. Lee Cremo is doing Mi'kmaq music because Mi'kmaq music traditions are about absorption. They're about taking the things that are around one and creating meaning from them, creating something new. So I found Smith's article to be quite fascinating. It's not very long, but, and of course, like all these articles, there's facts, and it's cool to get the biography of someone. But it goes back to this thing, and it has to, particularly within the Cape Breton context, this hegemony of Scottishness that has occurred in the second half of the 20th century. This this idea of that this is the domain of a particular population, and it's a particular population that has become representative of place, and the people who are participating in it, who are not of that same sort of ethnocultural heritage, are welcome. In a sort of patronizing way, they are welcome to participate. They are beloved, and they can be held up as exemplary, but in a way, they are not participating in their own culture, they are participating in this one. Whereas people like Cremo, people like Jerry Holland perhaps might work as well, they are not playing tourist. They are demonstrating adeptness at a style that clearly, you can make arguments, doesn't have analogs within their own musical tradition, but it is the really role of the very function, the very act of adaptation that is part of the Mi'kmaq tradition that he is demonstrating. I just love this article. So it makes its point so beautifully. So as I said, it's a short article. Some of it has to do with facts. But if you're taking something from this, think about what happens when someone who we can easily other, when we are in positions of privilege, we can easily other, demonstrates a facility with an art form that we consider ostensibly ours. And what kind of gatekeeping we are doing when we are evaluating that person, even when we are evaluating that person in what we imagine to be positive. Yeah, that's what I have to say about Lee Cremo. Anyway, I wish you well, my friends.